So tonight, I'm going to read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's all over the place. You can find it on the internet. She comments that it's one of her most anthologized essays, and she gets a lot of mail about it. She died a couple years ago, I think, and she's just a very, very interesting author. I love her work. I've read quite a bit of her work. I don't read as much fiction as I should, but she is an author who I try to keep up with. So this is a picture of her when she was a young woman. Her dad was an anthropologist. She's always been fascinated with other cultures. She has written about a lot of things. I think she was a Fulbright in France. She loved languages, and you see a lot of this come across in her fiction, which often deals with political themes. And she herself, a woman in science fiction, so that was mostly a male-dominated field for a really long time. It's kind of evening out today. She was very aware of gender and stuff like that, so she plays with those ideas. In fact, in one of her first novels, The Left Hand of Darkness, in fact, I think it might be her first, it's about basically a diplomat who goes to a planet, and on this planet, everyone is hermaphroditic, and they can fall into one distinct sex or the other depending on whether they want to reproduce or something like that. And it's all about exploring how would something like that affect all of society. And it's an interesting novel. A lot of people really enjoy it. But if I had to pick, I'll show you my picks for things you should check out by her. But I'm just trying to give a little bit of background on her before we move on. I wanted to show a picture of her as a young woman. I feel like, especially with really great authors who achieve fame later in their lives, or great thinkers, we forget that they were young. She was young. And let's see here. See if it'll work. I love these photos. I think these are from the Paris Review, an interview that they had with her. She just has a mischievous look. And that's the kind of personality that I associate with her the most, because she's just intelligent, she's insightful, she toys with lots of ideas, and she will toy with taboos as well. All right. And so I want to show you a little bit of an acceptance speech. I'm not going to show you much. You can watch this whole thing. It's on the YouTube channel American Masters PBS. And this was back in 2014 when she accepted the award for the National Book Foundation's Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. Okay, so she's a very old woman here. She's not too far from her death. She knows this. I like the speech. She's introduced by Neil Gaiman, who's another really huge fantasy author, wrote The Sandman, American Gods, among other things. And she just kind of she makes funny faces on the way to the podium, as though she can't believe it or she's not worth all of the hubbub. She lowers down the microphone and talks about how she's shorter than everyone else. And she thumbs her nose basically at the publishing industry as a writer who's made a lot of money. Well, I don't know if she made a lot of money, but she made a decent amount of money. She was able to make a living. Basically saying, you're going down the wrong path. You're going down the wrong path, and we need to be really careful about profit. And she's also thinking about Amazon and automation and all that kind of stuff. We need to be very, very careful because the arts are incredibly important. We're going to watch these last few minutes of her speech because I think her words speak for themselves. But also I think this is giving a little bit of context to the story. So here's her speech.
I think hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now and can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine some real grounds for hope. We will need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, the realists of a larger reality. Right now, I think we need writers who know the difference between production of a market commodity and the practice of an art. Developing written material to suit sales strategies in order to maximize corporate profit and advertising revenue is not quite the same thing as responsible book publishing or authorship. Thank you, brave applauders. Yet,
I just want to pause it right there, because there are big names in publishing, okay, in that room. Authors who have to worry about writing things that will sell. And she's talking about the giant elephant in the room within this industry. I don't think it can be emphasized enough how strange it might be to say something like this, knowing that all of the big names are in the room.
I see sales departments given control over editorial. I see my own publishers in a silly panic of ignorance and greed charging public libraries for an ebook 6 or 7 times more than they charge customers. We just saw a profiteer try to punish a publisher for disobedience, and writers threatened by corporate fatwa. And I see a lot of us, the producers, who write the books and make the books, accepting this, letting commodity profiteers sell us like deodorant and tell us what to publish and what to write. Well, I love you too, darling. Books, they're not just commodities. The profit motive is often in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. I have had a long career and a good one, in good company. Now here, at the end of it, I really don't want to watch American literature get sold down the river. We who live by writing and publishing want and should demand our fair share of the proceeds. But the name of our beautiful reward is not profit. Its name is freedom. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not much more I can say other than I love her ideas. I love how ornery she is. And I love that she's using fiction to try to show that there are other alternatives possible, right? So I'm not one of these people who thinks that fiction is philosophy, right? I think that philosophy very distinctively has formal qualities. It's emotionally cold, right? It's not usually trying to elicit emotion, although good philosophy can. It's analytic. I don't think literature really is doing that when it's good. That said, I think that you, as a literate person or as someone who's interested in this, should be acquainted with certain ideas, because human expression can teach you things about ideas or help you to inhabit a world or help you to take other perspectives. Good philosophy might do that as well, but literature can do that very, very well, and even better than philosophy in some respects. So that's partially why I've chosen to include this story in the class, right? So this isn't going to talk about the stuff that's related to this in the module for this particular section, but this short story is incredibly, incredibly popular. It's anthologized a lot. I've read it literally dozens of times, many times out loud to different classes, different friends, because it's very short. And it sticks with you, I guess. So I'm going to do something that's maybe a little third grade, right? Maybe it's not something that a college professor should do, but I'm going to read you the story, okay? And this is like anthologized a lot. As I said, you can buy the ebook for a couple dollars, and it's really just like a five or 6 page story, depending on the print size. And then it's a bunch of material also around that. I will read you the preface that she wrote to this particular story after we read the story, but I want to read it first. And I think I'm also going to interrupt it at times to emphasize a couple of really important moves that I think she's making. She's not writing just like straightforward narrative-driven fiction. This is very much self-aware, and she addresses the reader a few times throughout writing. And I think that she's trying to get us to think through a few different things, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit. Okay. All right, so the story starts here. With the clamor of bells that set the swallows soaring, the festival of summer came to the city Omelas, bright towered by the sea. The rigging of the boats in harbor sparkled with flags. In the streets between the houses with red roofs and painted walls, between old moss-grown gardens and under avenues of trees, past great parks with public buildings, processions moved. Some were decorous, old people in long stiff robes of mauve and gray, grave master workmen, quiet, merry women carrying their babies and chatting as they walked. In other streets, the music beat faster, a shimmering of gong and tambourine, and the people went dancing. The procession was a dance. Children dodged in and out, their high calls rising like swallows crossing flights over the music and the singing. All the processions wound toward the north side of the street, where on the great water meadow called the Green Fields, boys and girls, naked in the bright air, with mud-stained feet and ankles and long lithe arms, exercised their restive horses before the race. The horses wore no gear at all, but a halter without a bit. Their manes were braided with streamers of silver, gold, and green. They flared their nostrils and pranced and boasted to one another. They were vastly excited, the horse being the only animal who has adopted our ceremonies as his own. Far off to the north and west, the mountains stood up half encircling Omelas on her bay. The air of morning was so clear that the snow still crowning the 18 peaks burned with white gold fire across the miles of sunlit air. Under the dark blue of the sky, there was just enough wind to make the banners that marked the racecourse snap and flutter now and then. In the silence of the broad green meadows, one could hear the music winding through the city streets, farther and nearer and ever approaching, a cheerful faint sweetness of the air that from time to time trembled and gathered together and broke out into the great joyous clanging of bells. Joyous. How is one to tell about joy? How to describe the citizens of Omelas? They were not simple folk, you see, though they were happy. But we do not say the words of cheer much any more. All smiles have become archaic. Given a description such as this one tends to make certain assumptions. Given a description such as this one tends to look next for the king, mounted on a splendid stallion and surrounded by his noble knights, or perhaps in a golden litter borne by great-muscled slaves. But there was no king. They did not use swords or keep slaves. They were not barbarians. I do not know the rules and laws of their society, but I suspect that they were singularly few. As they did without monarchy and slavery, so they also got on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb. Yet I repeat, these were not simple folk, not dulcet shepherds, noble savages, bland utopians. They were not less complex than us. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by pedants and sophisticates, of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist, a refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. If you can't lick 'em, join 'em. If it hurts, repeat it. But to praise despair is to condemn delight. To embrace violence is to lose hold of everything else. So I think that this is really important, okay? She's writing a story that obviously has utopian themes. These people are happy. Everything is working well in society, at least so far as we've learned, right? And she's addressing a skeptical reader. Throughout her career, she was basically insulted as only being a writer of fantasy and science fiction. Literature later gussied this up by inventing the term speculative fiction, right? Because if you wanted to write serious fiction, you wrote realist literature, or you wrote literature like the so-called greats. You did not include magic. You did not include aliens. You didn't include sci-fi elements. But she's saying, you're boring, right? You're boring. We don't have to focus on pain. We don't have to think that happiness is naive. Let's go there. So I know, critic, that you're not sold by this idea. And she's kind of calling them out. This is one of the many things that she does in the story that I think is really interesting. We have almost lost hold. We can no longer describe a happy man, nor make any celebration of joy. How can I tell you about the people of Omelas? They were not naive and happy children, though their children were, in fact, happy. They were mature, intelligent, passionate adults whose lives were not wretched. Oh, miracle! But I wish I could describe it better. I wish I could convince you. Omelas sounds in my words like a city in a fairy tale, long ago and far away once upon a time. Perhaps it would be best if you imagined it as your own fancy bids, assuming it will rise to the occasion, for certainly I cannot suit you all. All right, so here is the second really big part that I wanted to emphasize. If you don't buy into her utopia, she's inviting you to imagine your own. Okay? Imagine your own. So, a cooperative element. She, as the author, but I think this point of view in the writing, it could very well be an anthropologist, it could be a reporter. Given her background and kind of what she writes about, that would make sense. And she's saying, look, if you don't buy this, if I'm not providing good enough details, feel free to fill in the stuff, right? This is a cooperative enterprise, reader. Let's work together to imagine the society, all right? For instance, how about technology? I think that there would be no cars or helicopters in and above the streets. This follows from the fact that the people of Omelas are happy. Happiness is based on a just discrimination of what is necessary, what is neither necessary nor destructive, and what is destructive. In the middle category, however, that of unnecessary and undestructive, that of comfort, luxury, exuberance, etc., they could perfectly well have central heating, subway trains, washing machines, and all the kinds of marvelous devices not yet invented here, floating light sources, fuelless power, a cure for the common cold, or they could have none of that. It doesn't matter. As you like it. I incline you to think that people from towns up and down the coast have been coming to Omelas during the last days before the festival, on very fast little trains and double-deck trams, and that the train station of Omelas is actually the handsomest building in town, though plainer than the magnificent farmers' market. But even granted trains, I fear that Omelas so far strikes some of you as goody-goody. Smiles, bells, parades, horses, bleh. If so, please add an orgy. If an orgy would help you, don't hesitate. Let us not, however, have temples from which issue beautiful nude priests and priestesses, already half in ecstasy and ready to copulate with any man or woman, lover or stranger, who desires union with the deep Godhead of the blood, although that was my first idea. But really, it would be better not to have any temples in Omelas, at least not man temples. Religion, yes. Clergy, no. Surely, the beautiful nudes can just wander about, offering themselves like divine soufflés to the hunger of the needy and the rapture of the flesh. Let them join the processions. Let tambourines be struck above the copulations and the glory of desire be proclaimed upon the gongs. And, a not unimportant point, let the offspring of these delightful rituals be beloved and looked after by all. One thing I know there is none of in Omelas is guilt. But where else should there be? I thought at first that there were no drugs, but that's puritanical. For those who like it, the faint, insistent sweetness of Druze may perfume the ways of the city. Druze which first brings a great lightness and brilliance to the mind and limbs, and then after some hours, a dreamy languor, and wonderful visions at last of the very arcana and inmost secrets of the universe, as well as exciting the pleasure of sex beyond all belief, and it is not habit-forming. For more modest tastes, I think there ought to be beer. What else? What else belongs in the joyous city? All right. So again, addressing the skeptical reader, saying, I know you don't like to envision happiness. I know you don't like to envision utopia. I know that given how messed up our world seems today, you can't even think of a place where all of this is possible. But I'm telling you, there is a place. Omelas. Here's what's going on. They have sex, right? They have drugs. They have art. They have all sorts of things, right, that you would want, and everyone seems to be happy. Okay? What else? What else belongs in the joyous city? The sense of victory, surely. The celebration of courage. But, as we did without clergy, let us do without soldiers. The joy built upon successful slaughter is not the right kind of joy. It will not do. It is fearful, and it is trivial. A boundless and generous contentment, a magnanimous triumph, felt not against some outer enemy, but in communion with the finest and fairest in the souls of all men everywhere, and the splendor of the world's summer. This is what swells the hearts of the people of Omelas. The victory they celebrate is that of life. I really don't think many of them need to take the Druze. Most of the processions have reached the green fields by now. A marvelous smell of cooking goes forth from the red and blue tents of the provisioners. The faces of small children are amiably sticky. In the benign gray beard of a man, a couple of crumbs of rich pastry are entangled. The youths and the girls have mounted their horses and are beginning to group around the starting line of the course. An old woman, small, fat, and laughing, is passing out flowers from a basket, and tall young men wear her flowers in their shining hair. A child of 9 or 10 sits at the edge of a crowd, alone, playing on a wooden flute. People pause to listen and they smile, but they do not speak to him, for he never ceases playing and never sees them, his dark eyes wholly wrapped in the sweet, thin magic of the tune. He finishes and slowly lowers his hands holding the wooden flute. As if that little private silence were the signal, all at once, a trumpet sounds from the pavilion near the starting line. Imperious, melancholy, piercing. The horses rear on their slender legs, and some of them neigh in answer. Sober-faced, the young riders stroke the horses' necks and soothe them, whispering, "Quiet, quiet, there, my beauty, my hope." They begin to form in rank along the starting line. The crowds along the racecourse are like a field of grass and flowers in the wind. The festival of summer has begun. Do you believe? Do you accept the festival, the city, the joy? No? Then let me describe one more thing. In a basement, under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, or perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes, there is a room. It has one locked door and no window. A little light seeps in dustily between the cracks in the boards, secondhand from a cobwebbed window. Somewhere across the cellar, in one corner of the little room, a couple of mops with stiff, clotted, foul-smelling heads stand near a rusty bucket. The floor is dirt, a little damp to the touch, as cellar dirt usually is. The room is about 3 paces long and 2 wide, a mere broom closet or disused tool room. In the room, a child is sitting. It could be a boy or a girl. It looks about 6, but actually is nearly 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, and neglect. It picks its nose and occasionally fumbles vaguely with its toes or its genitals, and it sits hunched in the corner, farthest from the bucket and the 2 mops. It is afraid of the mops. It finds them horrible. It shuts its eyes, but it knows the mops are still standing there and the door is locked and nobody will come. The door is always locked and nobody ever comes. Except that sometimes, the child has no understanding of time or interval, sometimes the door rattles terribly and opens, and a person or several people are there. One of them may come in and kick the child to make it stand up. The others never come close, but peer in at it with frightened, disgusted eyes. The food bowl and the water jug are hastily filled. The door is locked. The eyes disappear. The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tool room, can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. "I'll be good," it says. "Please let me out, I'll be good." They never answer. The child used to scream for help at night and cry a good deal, but now it only makes a kind of whining. Yeah. And it speaks less and less often. It is so thin, there are no calves to its legs. Its belly protrudes. It lives on a half bowl of cornmeal and grease a day. It is naked. Its buttocks and thighs are a mass of festered sores as it sits in its own excrement continually. They all know it is there. All the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it. Others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not, but they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest, and the kindly weathers of their skies, depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. This is usually explained to the child when they are between 8 and 12. It's explained to the children, whenever they seem capable of understanding, and most of those who come to see the child are young people, though often enough an adult comes or comes back to see the child. No matter how well the matter has been explained to them, these young spectators are always shocked and sickened at the sight. They feel disgust, which they had thought themselves superior to. They feel anger, outrage, impotence, despite all the explanations. They would like to do something for the child, but there is nothing they can do. If the child were brought up into the sunlight out of that vile place, if it were cleaned and fed and comforted, that would be a good thing indeed. But if it were done, in that day and hour, all the prosperity and beauty and delight of Omelas would wither and be destroyed. Those are the terms. To exchange all the goodness and grace of every life in Omelas for that single, small improvement. To throw away the happiness of thousands for the chance of the happiness of one. That would be to let guilt within the walls indeed. The terms are strict and absolute. There may not even be a kind word spoken to the child. Often, the young people go home in tears, or in a tearless rage, when they have seen the child and faced this terrible paradox. They may brood over it for weeks or years, but as time goes on, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom. A little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no doubt, but little more. It is too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy. It has been afraid too long ever to be free of its fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement to sit in. Their tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive that the terrible justice of reality, and to accept it. Yet it is their tears and anger, their trying of their generosity and acceptance of their helplessness, which are perhaps the true source of the splendor of their lives. Theirs is no vapid, irresponsible happiness. They know that they, like the child, are not free. They know compassion. It is the existence of the child and their knowledge of its existence that makes possible the nobility of their architecture, the poignancy of their music, the profundity of their science. It is because of the child that they are so gentle with their children. They know that if the wretched one were not there sniveling in the dark, the other one, the flute player, could make no joyful music as the young riders line up their beauty for the race in the sunlight of the first morning of summer. Now do you believe them? Are they not more credible? But there is one more thing to tell, and this is quite incredible. So I'm going to stop there for a second. Now she's told you about the child in Omelas, and now that there's pain, she's returning to you. And she's putting, again, a very strange question to you, which is, now that it's not completely perfect and that there is some sort of catch, now do you find it more credible? Side note, should you find that more credible? Is happiness and political union so foreign to our minds that we can't possibly imagine a place like this? And it's only whenever there's imperfection, introduced that we start to believe, right? That's kind of what she's trying to get us to think. But she has one more thing to tell us, and she says it's quite incredible. At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who goes to see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not, in fact, go home at all. Sometimes, also a man or a woman, much older, falls silent for a day or two and then leaves home. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out the city of Omelas, through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Night falls. The traveler must pass down the village streets between the houses with yellow-lit windows, and on out into the darkness of the fields. Each alone, they go west or north toward the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist. But they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. So that's the story, right? That's the story. And in class, I like to just read this because it's obviously provocative. And as I said, I've read it dozens of times easily, and it still hits. I put online, and you can find online very easily, N.K. Jemison's response to this, The Ones Who Stay and Fight. You can read it. Jemison is like an interesting author. She's won a lot of awards, but I think it kind of misses the point, so that's why I don't really require it for class. I think one of the beautiful things about this story, maybe beautiful isn't the right word, is that it forces a dilemma on you. Okay, so whenever I teach this in class, often I ask people to group up and to ask what they would do. What would you do if you lived in Omelas, right? And very frequently, after, groups have had a pretty spirited discussion for at least a few minutes, people will come back and they'll try to come up with some sort of clever solution, right? We often want to find a way to have the happiness and to avoid the misery, right? What can we do? Can we sneak stuff to the child? Can we sneak them out, right? Can I volunteer to take that child's spot? Can we appease whatever the deal is by taking shifts? Any number of ways. A lot of people have tried to think of a different sort of solution, and that's just not possible. That's not the terms of the deal, right? It's absolute. It's harsh. Omelas is basically perfect. It's human, right? There's orgies, there's drugs. I'm sure that there's some amount of fighting, right? As friends might fight. That's probably okay in the city of Omelas, but there isn't war. There isn't cowardice. There isn't, assault outside of, this small child. People aren't naive. They aren't ungrateful. They understand what misery could be like, and they are incredibly grateful for the lives that they have. There are good people in Omelas. And if you do anything to that kid, all of that goes away. All of that goes away. So you're faced with a dilemma, okay? And the dilemma is this. Do you keep on living in Omelas, which sounds pretty amazing, but you know that that child is there? Whether you've seen the child or not, you know it's there. And you know that the happiness of your city depends on that child being in wretched misery. Covered in its feces, it has pressure sores all over itself. It wants its mom, it wants sunlight, it wants attention, but it's neglected and malnourished, and it's in the basement. Okay? And it's a young child. 11, who knows how long it's been there, right? Do you go along in Omelas? Or do you try to do something to rescue the child? And there's this interesting point in the story where it's not clear whether it's fabricated reason or whether it's like a legit sort of, insight that if you rescue this child, it's going to have a really hard time readapting to outside life, right? It's been in a basement for a really long time. It's not clear how long, but a really long time. Could a child experiencing that level of abuse and trauma really have a normal and happy life after that, right? That's a question. That's a question. I don't know the details of this abuse, right? Because a lot of stuff isn't said here. So do you go and try and rescue that child to give it a chance at happiness, right? No guarantee at happiness. It can't live in the happiness of Omelas, right? Because the happiness will crumble. So do you go out into the wilderness? Do you go out into a different city? Right? Or do you just leave Omelas? It's too much for you to enjoy Omelas and everything that goes on there, knowing that it's the expense of someone innocent. There's nothing that a child of that age can do that would deserve that torment, right? That's the other thing. It's not an adult, where maybe you could try to think of a way that, some sort of torture is justified. It's a child. It's a child. So do you just leave, right? And if you leave, you have no real idea what you're headed for, right? And so that's the question, right? That's the question. And I think that one of the more unsettling questions, and this is why I've asked you in your reflections to ask you to think about what you would do in this. What legitimately would you do what would you feel like? What it would be like if you stayed in Omelas? And what do you do? Because I think the unsettling place that this story also takes us is, how do we already live in Omelas? Because I think a lot of people, myself included, have a very strong visceral reaction to say, wow, that's really fucked up. Like, I wouldn't want to live in a society like that. I couldn't experience true joy if I knew that it was coming at the expense of a child, an innocent child, undergoing that kind of torture every single day, right? Something like that would taint my perception. But the truth of the matter is, we might already live in Omelas. It's just that our Omelas is not nearly as perfect or as happy. Because once you start to pierce the veil, I guess, you start to see textiles. You start to see the way factory farming works. You start to see the ecological effects of mining the precious metals for our electronics and devices, right? You start to see the ecological impact of having to cool servers for, the internet and Netflix and all that kind of stuff, and how much energy it uses, right? You start to see so many things where we are harming a lot of people. What keeps us from being able to walk away from those things as well, right? And it could just be this, this broad theme. And this is something that Theodor Adorno, you don't have to read him, obviously, but he's a German philosopher, critical thinker. He has this famous saying that there's no right life in falseness, right? The rough translation. But the idea being that in capitalism or in any, system with pervasive badness, you just can't have a good life. The systemic stuff is so overwhelming that even if you're living well within the system, you're still playing in the system, and that is not acceptable, right? If you're a good soldier for a terrible imperial force that goes around torturing people or that exploits people, right? You might be a good soldier, but you're still on a bad team, okay? So I think that Omelas, on the one hand, at least my first reaction was to be like, those people are fucked up, man. They can't just go along with what happened to that kid. But on the other hand, the thing is, why don't I look at my own life with the same sort of moral clarity? Because I am no better than the people of Omelas in a lot of ways. And what I'm getting for the maybe moral badness is not nearly as good as what the people of Omelas are getting. Okay. So this story, and the reason I don't really like Jemson's reply to this story is deeply ambivalent. Deeply, deeply ambivalent. And ambivalent here meaning two ways of feeling about something. Because it's not clear. It's not clear. And this is often a trope in very well written utopias and dystopias, especially in utopias. But something like A Brave New World, for example, by Aldous Huxley. In these kinds of stories, it's not clear whether it's a good or a bad society if the author has done a good job. And if those are your options, live in Omelas, knowing what everyone knows, or to walk away, sincerely, what would you do? What would you do? Right? Because there's not an easy answer. And I think that's kind of what this story is trying to get us to feel. All right. Now I'm not usually a fan of people, as in the sense of, fanboying or fangirling someone. But Ursula K. Le Guin, before she died, she had like a website that she wrote, on herself, and you could send her letters. And I sent her a letter and, asked her if the ones who walk away from Omelas is seen as a refutation of utilitarianism. Because utilitarian philosophy is about the greatest good for the greatest number involved, right? Is it producing more pleasure than pain? That's the hedonic utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. Or is it producing more happiness than unhappiness in the Aristotelian sense? That's this eudaimonic utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill. But on the whole, the action itself doesn't matter. What matters are the consequences or the results that follow, right? And given that, you look at the misery of the child, but the overall flourishing of thousands of people, does it seem like the utilitarian is forced to say, like, if this actually were possible, right? If this actually were possible, would they be forced to say, yes, we should leave Omelas be, and we should want to live there, right? Especially if we compare Omelas to contemporary society, right? And so I asked her about this. I didn't write that detailed of a note, but I asked her about, refuting this type of philosophy. And she wrote me this small note, and she sent me like a sticker with her signature, a book plate, right? And she says, this is back in 2012. Boomer, I never was very happy with German philosophers. Get on much better with Lao Tzu, whom no one would accuse of utilitarianism, and perhaps not even philosophy, ? Right? So she's saying, I think I probably said something about Kant. So she's like, yeah, and never really liked German philosophy all that much. I mostly read Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, depending on how you pronounce that. She even did a kind of like a translation of the Tao Te Ching. And she said, Lao Tzu definitely isn't utilitarian, and maybe some people wouldn't even call him a philosopher. I don't know, but he's kind of who I go to when I think of philosophy. And then she says right here, mostly I read novels for my ontology. I recommend them. All the best, Ursula. Right. So she obviously didn't write it in mind with the utilitarianism in mind, but I think it's useful for the sake of our ethics class to think of this. And here are my reading recommendations as well. This is also why I show it because I'm a nerd and I love Ursula Le Guin, but I also show it because this novel here, it's one of her shortest ones, and it's kind of predictable in the sense that it's a humans versus nature sort of narrative, but the word for world is forest. The word for world is forest. I recommend that novel above any of her other ones because her other ones can get long. Her other ones can be kind of weird. They may or may not be too abstract. I think this one is short. It's perfect. It's told from the point of view of many, many characters. It's just a fantastic piece of writing. I think that if you're going to read any novel by her, it should be that one. And if you like her short stories, in addition to Omelas and in addition to what you can find for free online for sure, is this collection called The Birthday of the World and Other Stories. It's just like an interesting collection of her stuff. And again, they're short stories, right? So it's not too big of a time commitment. So it's kind of interesting. You can see the adhesive from the old used bookstore sticker. So I wanted to give that plug. And lastly, right, since I've kind of been talking about the story, I want to read the preface to this particular story because she also has an afterword, but she has the preface, which I think is kind of interesting to hear. All right. So this is her talking. This is her talking about her story. The central idea of this psychomyth, the scapegoat, turns up in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and several people have asked me, rather suspiciously, why I gave credit to William James, right? Because the subtitle to this story is a variation on a theme by William James. So people are kind of like provoking her. They're kind of poking her, prodding her, saying, why would you say William James, the psychologist and philosopher, rather than Dostoevsky? Dostoevsky was talking about this. She replies, the fact is, I haven't been able to reread Dostoevsky, much as I loved him, since I was 25, and I'd simply forgotten he used the idea. But when I met it in James's The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, it was with a shock of recognition. Here is how James put it. So this is a quote by James. Or, if the hypothesis were offered us of a world in which Monsignors Fourier and Bellamy's and Morris's utopias should all be outdone, and millions kept permanently happy on the simple condition that a certain lost soul on the far-off edge of things should lead a life of lonely torment, what except a specifical and independent sort of emotion can it be which would make us immediately feel, even though an impulse arose within us to clutch at the happiness so offered, how hideous a thing would be its enjoyment when deliberately accepted as the fruit of such a strange bargain? Right? So William James is entertaining the ideas of some other thinkers, and he's saying, look, given the idea that there might be this utopia, but it's at the cost of one person, would you really want to experience that deep happiness of a utopia? Because it seems as though if you knew that it came at the cost of the torture of one person, that would taint everything, even your experience of the goodness. Right? So Le Guin says, the dilemma of the American conscience can hardly be better stated. Dostoevsky was a great artist and a radical one, but his early social radicalism reversed itself, leaving him a violent reactionary, whereas the American James, who seems so mild, so naively gentlemanly, look how he says us, assuming all his readers are as decent as himself, was and remains a genuinely radical thinker. Directly after the Lost Soul passage, he goes on. So we have another passage by James. All the higher, more penetrating ideals are revolutionary. They present themselves far less in the guise of effects of past experience than in that of probable causes of future experience, factors to which the environment and the lessons it has so far taught us must learn to bend. Back to Le Guin. The application of those two sentences to the story and to science fiction and all thinking about the future is quite direct. Ideals as the, quote, probable causes of future experience. That is a subtle and exhilarating remark. Of course, I didn't read James and sit down and say, now I'll write a story about that lost soul. It seldom works that simply. I sat down and started a story just because I felt like it, with nothing but the word Omelas in mind. It came from a road sign, Salem, Oregon, backwards. Don't you read road signs backwards? Pots, walls, Nerdlik, Oxiknarf Nas, Salem, equals Shlomo, equals Salam, equals peace. Melas, O Melas, Omelas, Omdelas. Where do you get your ideas from, Miss Le Guin? From forgetting Dostoevsky and reading road signs backwards, naturally. Where else? She could wax philosophical. She could be a pretentious ass about the story. This is after the fact. It's been anthologized a lot. Everyone thinks it's brilliant. What does she do? She speaks in plain language. She provides the impetus for her inspiration, and she tells jokes about legitimately how she got the ideas, right? There's a certain humility there. She's deeply, deeply revolutionary. She wants us to think of other worlds, other possibilities, but she's also incredibly humble. And she's not saying it's my brilliance. It's like I was reading some interesting stuff and I was playing some games and I came upon this idea and then I put in the work to write a story. That's where it came from, right? No magic, no pretense. There's just something really wonderful about her, right? And so that's the beginning of the story. So I highly recommend that you buy this if you like this story, and it has an afterword. Okay, it's a couple bucks I think for the ebook. I don't know if you can find this around anywhere, but yeah, that's it. That's it. It's a harsh story, right? It's a harsh story, but I think that it's really important, and I think that just the general themes of Le Guin are really important as well. I just love these pictures. The Paris Review did a great job. I can't remember the photographer. I should have credited them. And I think that the theme of Omelas and just Le Guin generally is something that holds especially now, right? The world it's not great right now. It's not great right now to be in the United States. It's really, really tough. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of pain, right? But someone like Le Guin invites us to imagine possibilities and invites us to imagine the potential that we could be free and how we can achieve that. And she reminds us, this is why I, a philosophy PhD, some blowhard who teaches you all of these arcane theories from thousands of years ago and drones on about Greek and German and French and all of this stuff. Why would I waste your time with ideas? Well, it's because I think that, and philosophy doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom. So I'm not just saying just philosophy, but philosophy, literature, history, the humanities. They can teach you to think of alternatives. It's like the Dave Foster Wallace thing. We get into these default settings, these automatic ways of considering the world and splitting it apart and saying some things are good and some things are bad, some things are beautiful, some things are ugly, some things are right, some things are wrong. Some things are just, some things are unjust. Okay? We do that naturally because of what we are. We're social beings. We understand and manipulate values since the time that we're 5 years old, right? That can become automatic. Le Guin, other philosophers, right? Religions, historians, they invite us to think of other ways. Because if we want to make the world better, we have to be able to clearly envision new values, but just new worlds. We could tear everything down, and I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't tear things down at certain moments in history, okay? So I'm not making an apology of the system. But once we're done tearing things down, we have to rebuild things. And whenever we rebuild things, what are the ideas that we're going to use to make the architecture of that new place? Who are the heroes in our stories going to be? What is our art going to look like? I think that's the takeaway here. That's the takeaway here. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope there's been a couple of provocative ideas here. And as always, my inbox is open. So students, feel free to email. We can set up some time to meet on Discord or whatever else. I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, right? I hope that you're finding ways to indulge in small things. Maybe you're getting out, whatever else it is. It's not easy. It's not easy to just survive. So I hope that you're loving yourselves. I hope that you're loving one another. And I will see y'all next time. Have a good night.